guys. So for those of you who are in the Discord, you'll probably know what's going on. We were supposed to have a coalition tonight, and Jen and I were super excited to talk about the current Johnson and Johnson debacle, because we've been covering the COVID thing basically since the channel started. But unfortunately, Jen's back went out. She's been having a lot of physical problems. If you've seen her latest video, she talked about it actually a little bit. So we're hoping that she'll be getting better. We have kind of some solutions that she's going to be working on, trying to figure out how to deal with maybe some of the causes of her pain might not necessarily be unpreventable. And so she's going to try to see if, say, things like getting a new mattress or something might help. Oh, thank you so much, Akeda Hakubi, with the first super chat of the live stream, $5 super chat. So for everybody who was not for everybody who was not around for the vote, there was a vote in my Discord server. Links in the description below if you want to join and hang out with us. You will be confined to a small holding area for, it depends on the person, how much you participate, how long it takes my mods to get to know you for a little bit. But you do have access to the polls and stuff that I do in the announcement section when the coalition gets canceled. So you guys ended up voting. A friend of mine convinced me to put this poll option up here. It originally was not one of the options that I was going to consider, but I've been ranting at them about it for weeks because I've been reading a really amazing book on the history of American knitting, and they convinced me that my audience might actually care about the crazy obsessions I get with history. Maybe a little bit. So because Gaius is a major history buff who has had many conversations with me about this particular topic as well, I decided to invite him on to hang out with me. So we're going to be talking about a particular period in history that I'm kind of passionate about. We're going to be talking Revolutionary War women's activism. So welcome, by the way, Gaius, if you want to quickly introduce yourself. He is the newest mod in my Discord server.
Hey.
And also lives right down the street from me, but
Yeah, that is literally true. There's a running joke that if anything comes up, I can just basically run over and say, "Hey, do I need to come over and poke you with a stick to get on track?" Anyway, yeah, I'm Gaius. In the Discord server, I am Gaius, the Bard of Eire, which is basically the Bard of Ireland. And it's just a running joke of me being a complete history nerd. Bards historically were historians, as well as keepers of people.
Thank you so much, Tara. And yeah, it actually was voted on way faster than I expected it to be. Yeah. It overtook the original option that people were going for, which was worker co-ops, and I want to say an hour and a half.
Jeez, less than that. I want to say the first 30 minutes or so. It was disturbingly fast. Yeah, and the funny thing was with this particular topic, I think what made it even funnier was we got onto this topic, just the two of us, completely randomly, because I was talking to you about getting into crocheting and knitting on my own. You had brought up the book that you found talking about American knitting.
So for those of you who aren't familiar, again, with me on Discord, if you hang out in my Discord, you probably already know that I knit all the things all the time. If you follow me on Twitter, you've probably seen some of them. It's one of the ways in which I honor Athena. That's one of the big things. I almost nicknamed this stream EA Ergane because that is the aspect of Athena that I tend to honor the most often. But Gaius was actually kind enough the other day to help me out with a medical emergency when I wouldn't have been able to get a ride. And we ended up talking about this among a few other topics at length while we were waiting for the doctor to be able to see me.
Well, sitting in a car and the waiting room, why the hell not?
Yeah, we had nothing better to do. Yeah, thankfully, this urgent care didn't have that long of a wait time. But yeah, I was dealing with some health issues. They've resolved themselves by now. But Gaius was kind enough to give me an emergency ride because, again, he lives right down the street. And I called two other friends, and my partners were already at work, so the car was not available. So I was able to, thankfully, I bought him a coffee, which was the only thing that he would let me do, but that he was thankfully there for me, and I'm really really grateful because it turned out it actually was at least somewhat of an emergency, and I did need treatment for it. So,
Yeah.
but coming back to sort of the topic at hand, American knitting stuff. So the female Boston Tea Party, in which we are talking here. Oh, thank you so much, Jericho Spades. So not the smooth talking, singing sex fiends D&D turned them into. I'm not. Are you talking about?
bards?
Oh, okay, yeah. No, bards traditionally in like Greece were actually a sort of pseudo historians themselves. I'll
Yeah.
talk about that, and if we could talk about that in a future live stream, if you guys are down for that. If I end up with a solo stream, because these seem to happen periodically. But let's.
Well, bards. This ties in together actually with this. It's very tangential because with how the Boston Tea Party and the women's Boston Tea Party thing tied together. Women didn't have political power at the time, so
In fact, some
those
husbands would bar them from discussing politics at all, so much
oh
so
yeah,
that we've got written records of women being like, you know, we might be the weaker sex, but like you're not going to stop me from telling you what I think.
oh yeah,
You don't have to listen to me. I don't have the right to vote, but you can't stop me from telling you what I think.
oh yeah. There were multiple women who like got together and did stuff regardless of, excuse me, what the men folks told them to do, which is how the women's knitting party started. Um, Bards were a thing. The difference is that what D&D turned them into is kind of a parody of what a bard at the time became. The bard that we associate D&D with, the singing "I'm so hip I can talk my way into anything and I can, I'm sexy and all that," the Fabio kind of bard, um, is actually kind of a running joke with the traveling minstrel of the 18th century. It's the and it's actually a stereotype of the Irish rover and the Scottish rover, um, that would travel from taverns and bars up and down the coasts, and especially in the colonies. So during the Revolutionary War, while the men would go to these bars and taverns, and this is where the revolution was effectively planned, and even up through the middle of the war, up until Valley Forge, when the army was
We
effectively
you're kind of starting
coalesced.
to go off into the weeds a bit. We need to
Well,
tie this back to what you were
well,
starting to talk
here's how
about.
it ties back. The men would go to the bars. Well, where did the women go? They collected at each other's homes where all the spinning tools were.
Well, and this is where we need to go back for a second. For those, like, we did not get very good educations, most of us.
Oh, God,
Some
yeah.
of us kind of know a little bit about the Boston Tea Party, but let's start there. Let's start with what we know of the legend and what's true and what's not, because we've had some interesting discussions about misconceptions people have. For example, most of them were not dressed as natives when they got there. And second, it was not a massive like all of the colonists were angry about these tariffs. It was a select group of elites at first that were mad about the tariffs and about their inability to continue bootlegging tea from elsewhere because the British Navy was starting to interfere. It wasn't just like they were taxing them heavily on British stuff. It was also that they were stopping them from getting the untaxed bootleg tea from other places.
On top of that, so the Boston Tea Party, in and of itself, was 1774, 70, early 1770s. 5 years before, and this is something that actually isn't really brought up a lot in American schools. There was a royal decree that actually was passed and signed by Parliament that anything west of the Appalachian Mountains was considered off limits for colonization. As in, no expansion beyond this point. It was defined sovereign territory of the native tribes. The king recognized their sovereignty.
That lasted so very long.
It really did, and that actually was an extra spurring point into the Boston Tea Party.
So let's talk about the
it was
actual
a lot
event
of that.
itself. What happened during the Boston Tea Party?
So, fun thing, the Boston Tea Party is now a lot of people think the Boston Tea Party is a bunch of these guys.
Kelpie gave me $10 for keeping you in line. Thank you so much. Kelpie is Gaius's significant other.
Yep. Hi, Kelpie. So, the common misconception for those Americans in the audience, and I know there's quite a few, and probably a few British members. The common myth is a bunch of revolutionaries before the revolution actually kicked off stormed the boats of British and specifically East Indian Trade Company ships.
Which the East Indian Trade Company, for those of you who aren't familiar, was absolutely in bed with like the British monarchy. Like they were, there were so many laws and restrictions, even in the motherland, so to speak, that basically gave them an undeserved monopoly over a lot of different industries. Like they were a part of the reason why a lot of monopoly laws actually got passed here.
They had their own private army that actually rivaled the
British Navy.
The British Navy and the British standing army, like the actual Royal Army, which is actually...
Yeah, at one point the Royals actually got worried they would get overthrown because like of taxation.
Mm-hmm. And yes, the 666, the anime cat, they did invade India.
Didn't they also invade China, like the Opium Wars?
They invaded Hong Kong, got pushed back, asked for
the Chinese government was like, no, you will not infest our entire country with drugs. Like you are not going to get our entire country addicted to this highly addictive substance that you have refined. Yeah. And like the frickin' East India Trading Company was like, want to bet?
Yep, yeah, basically. The other thing with that is there's a fun little thing with that one. With the East India Trade Company, that back with the back when it came to the American colonies, that very specifically when it comes to the Boston Tea Party, a lot of them had
hey, for those of you who are complaining about Gaius's mic being a bit low, is that better? I turned him up.
Okay, yeah. Well, it was taxation without representation, Jericho. Here's the thing.
It was taxation without representation, but the thing is also the American gentry were mad they weren't given the priority that the British gentry were. Because, like, the House of Lords was a thing, even back then. And, like, American gentry were kind of considered to be inferior in the same way that in the Great Depression you had the old money, new money trope, like with all the drug lords and stuff that ascended during the Prohibition. You get a very similar thing. Like, modern billionaires, like, if you somehow manage to be the 0.0001% of people that manages to rise to millionaire, billionaire status, there are certain social cues that you do not learn as a lower or middle class person, which we're all the lower class, like we all are. There is no middle class. There is only... you are in such severe poverty you cannot function, or you are at a comfortable living position, but still technically in poverty compared to the 1%. Like there is nothing, if you're one paycheck away from losing your house, then there's no such thing as middle class.
Yeah, effectively.
But anyway, like if you're going back to that, they were mad that they didn't get treated as rich bastards, particularly the Southern plantation owners, because that was a big part of the American economy.
And another part is like the Northern industrialists, which Jefferson, Paul Revere. So we're talking silversmiths. We're talking um, a lot of the big names that we see on the Declaration. These guys had money. So when they were asking for representation, there were actual sympathizers in Parliament. Here's the catch. They told the Americans, okay, you want representation? You're going in the House of Commons. The American gentry, the rich, said, no, we have just as much money as you. We want a spot in the House of Lords.
But there was still a lot of manifest destiny going on back then.
Oh, yeah. Oh, goodness gracious.
For those of you who don't know what manifest destiny is, it's the idea that the king has been given his place, and so have the lords by God.
Yeah.
And there's also the idea there's also the idea that the Americans were the Americas were laid out by God to be taken over and the savages tamed by the colonizers. That is what manifest destiny is.
Right.
I'm not saying that as something that I believe. As a half-breed savage myself, I have a problem with that idea. Thank you. But like that's where we're at. Like that's what they believe.
And that's why the 1767 Declaration, the Appalachian Declaration, actually is a sticking point within the Boston Tea Party, because while it's not regularly discussed, and most First Nations and Native, because you got to keep in mind the Appalachians actually do stretch up into Canada, so I do have to make that point. First Nations being the Canadian term for the native tribes there, and the
Marrowcat, the Divine Right of Kings is another name for manifest destiny.
Right. And the Native American tribes here in the States, anything west of the Appalachian Mountains was declared off limits for further colonization, basically restricting everything to the 13 colonies and potentially Florida.
Because Florida's America's dick.
Well, yeah. So when the Boston Tea Party finally got kicked off, the first like 2 or 3 ships were actually beer and tea.
The captain knew they were coming.
The captains knew they were coming.
They let them on the boat.
Most of the deckhands actually helped tip the stuff over. They broke open casks of the beer. They shared out.
They got drunk, and that's when the Native American dressing happened.
And even then, it was not that many. It ended up being like 15 out of like 60, which, like, if you do the math, like, yes, that's a good percentage.
That's very diluted tea.
Yeah.
So, like, all of those images of, like, the Boston Harbor being turned into a giant teacup are very much a misnomer.
Oh, yeah.
But this happened, and it was actually not a singular event. There were several of these that happened over a period of time. Like, there's the one big event that everybody, like, sort of heroizes, but much like what we're about to talk about with women's activism, this was not a singular event. It was just sort of valorized in songs and poems and history books as a one-sentence quip that happened, maybe a couple paragraph quip, not the weeks and months of active, like, property destruction and protesting, and basically the equivalent of if rich people rioted, that's what this would be. Like, I'm going to poke my pinky out while I drink my beer and toss this tea overboard and walk away, and the cops don't even care. That's basically what it was. There was no risk for these people when they did this.
So
not comparatively anyway.
Right. So Anime Cat, the reason that the native thing, as far as the question goes, based on the way you phrased it, the reason that the native garb is emphasized in American schooling is because it's a sticking point. It's something that sticks out in the story. It's like if I told you one of the Greek myths as an example, there's always going to be something that always sticks out as in any story. There's always going to be something that's going to be a feature. With the Boston Tea Party, that specific story. It's going to be they threw tea into the Boston Harbor, so that's a sticking point. Some people dressed, put
Some people
on
dressed it well. It's also this sort of tall tale thing too, right?
right.
There's the whole never tell a lie. There's this idea that an extremely noticeable or notable detail can grow taller than its boots over time. So the fact that a few
Mhm.
of them did that, they didn't do that to evade capture, which is the story that gets told and perpetuated. There was a couple people that did it because they were drunk and it was dumb.
And the drunker that people got, the weirder things that they did. Native American dress was but one of the things, and it was only during that one particular event. There
Well,
are
yeah, and
other.
again, these events happened over the course of months.
Oh God, yeah.
So we need to kind of move a little bit forward toward the women's version because, like, women's activism, women played a much larger role in the Revolutionary War than anybody gives them credit for. And this is where, now that we've kind of given you guys a little bit of history, the Boston Tea Parties, plural, were going on. Variations on this were going on all through the colonies. And so what happened though were that these regulations that they were passing on trade didn't just affect tea and beer and other things that you think of as traditionally being imported. They also affected very basic household wares, things like textiles, cotton, linen, like wool, things that were primarily imported. And what the British tried to do at one point was they tried to make it illegal to purchase any textile or wool from anywhere other than Britain. So basically, you could not make your own clothes legally in the Americas during the time that this was going on. Poorer women, particularly the lower class, because there wasn't really a middle class in America at this time. There was the gentry and then there was everybody else. Well, everybody else's wife was pretty fucking used at this point to spinning wool, flax, cotton. These are things that were being grown. Like, again, in the South, the cotton fields and things, they're a stereotype for a reason. This was a necessity. They had to do this in order to clothe themselves. Now, granted, during the time, there was this sort of divide between the gentry and the common folk. There was this idea that the common folk had to make their own clothes and that they were somehow worse or more rough spun or in some way lower quality because they had to be handmade.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when this starts coming about, the women folk get some ideas in our weaker heads, and I'm, yes, saying this absolutely fucking facetiously. Like, it was hard enough to be able to just do that on their own. And keep in mind, there was also this sort of cottage industry of like poorer widows teaching the women of the gentry, their daughters, to like knit and sew and things. This is an industry that was essential to what it meant to be a woman. Like men, young boys were sent to schools where they were taught like arithmetic and reading and history and the classics and all that stuff. And some of them might have even been taught the art of war, right? Like they were trained. Women were sent to these schools where the big advertisement that you see over and over is knitting, needlecraft, embroidery, sewing can be taught in the style of the aristocracy of these other countries, these big passionate things. So making your own shit, so to speak, was essential to being a woman. Clothing your family, repairing those clothes, it was as essential as cooking and cleaning and raising the children. In fact, male and female children both knitted
Mm-hmm.
right up until they hit about their teen years, when men stopped doing it and the girls kept.
Well, and it also depended on where the cultural divide came from. So here's where things get really interesting. Down in the South, you'll start finding a very specific cultural split. From Virginia down into the Carolinas, you'll have a mixture of Scots-Irish, Germans, Dutch, and some Swedes. And then in the north, you'll generally have British, Germans, French, and some lowland Scots, mostly lowland Scots. So
Okay, let's
think like the
not get
Edinburgh
too
area.
deep into the demographics.
Well, the reason I'm saying this is because it ties in with that cottage core, that cottage industry.
Well, and keep in mind, this wasn't necessarily a choice people were making either. It was expensive to buy this stuff that was British made. Yeah. Like it was illegal in the Americas to have spinning machines that were like not manual, like electrical spinning machines or like textile weaving machines were illegal. Like you could not have them here.
Yeah, and weirdly enough, that actually didn't change until closer to closer towards the Civil War. Weirdly enough, you had
they actually had to bring them over and reverse engineer the designs to make sort of bootleg versions for the Americas. And even then, those industries, a lot of women, especially poorer women, would actually make a pretty healthy side income making stockings and stuff for the gentry. That was a thing that they did. And again, older women would teach their children.
Yeah. Well, part of the reason that I bring up the demographic specifically is Scottish, Irish, Germans.
We went through them earlier.
Especially in the lower, poorer classes, everyone sewed and knitted. It didn't matter. Everyone did.
Well, and if you go back and you look at like their diary entries, like children especially, you would see, knitted a little and then helped mom with dinner, knitted a little, while talking to XYZ person, knitted, some children had like special numbers of rounds they had to do. So what happened when these regulations came down was that basically the lower class women went, hell fucking no. And so the Women's Boston Tea Party effectively was that a bunch of women swore, like they took oaths, that they would clothe their entire family in clothing of their own make. And so all around the country, but especially concentrated around Boston, Massachusetts was where a lot of these movements started. You would get these women that would go out and they would bring mass amounts of cotton, linen, flax, wool, all of these things to churches. And they would have massive numbers of spinning wheels in churches. They'd gather all of this excess from the entire community and they'd host these massive spinning parties where they would spin these things into yarn. Sometimes they would take breaks and do knitting while other folks were spinning, but they would spin this massive amount of stuff into yarn. They would take some home for their own families and the rest would be distributed to everybody within the parish's community.
So think of it like a big co-op. But instead of like making generally a big profit off of it, a lot of it would be donated.
The majority of this were like people didn't want to have to spin their own stuff, and so like aristocracy would donate excess, and it's like you can keep a percentage of this for your parish, and the rest comes back. And so they provided their labor not for pay, but for materials, which they could then spite the British gentry with. And the British actually tried to crack down on this. There were arrests and things that happened over this because it was illegal to do your own spinning and weaving.
Which actually, now, if I can, this is actually really hard to find records of. And before even joining the stream, one of the things I was trying to find, there used to be a record of, and let me tell you, trying to find records of anything Revolutionary War, specifically regarding any of the women's activism stuff, is a pain.
Well, here's a Daughters of Liberty record that this is from No Idle Hands. They talk about there were the stamp tax resistors, the Sons of Liberty, and an able spokeswoman, Milka Martha Moore of Philadelphia, hailed such an economic clout in lines from her patriotic poesy. So this is about their stuff. Let the Daughters of Liberty nobly arise, and though we've no voice but a negative here, the use of the taxables let us forbear. Join mutual in this, but small as it seems, we may jostle a Greenville and puzzle his schemes. Then merchants import till your stores are full. May the buyers be few and your traffic be dull. So, like, we do actually have, like, bits and pieces. There's one from a Bostonian who wrote, a piece for a newspaper where he talked about, he says, "You may keep your goods. Thank God we have a glorious country. We can subsist independent of the whole world. A spirit of economy and industry has wonderfully diffused itself through this whole province, and it's scarcely credible how many females of all ranks have in this town have learned to spin. I have 10 children, one a daughter 14 years old. This daughter is constantly employed in spinning. Both myself, my wife, and all my children wear clothes of her industry alone, all our stockings and gloves. My girl spins, my wife assists in knitting. I cannot buy 3 pair of English woven stockings here for under 6 shillings a sterling a pair, and I firmly declare that 1 pair of mine is worth the lot of the whole 3.
Now, to put that in perspective, 6 shillings today, 6 shillings then is like the equivalent of like $40 to $50 today. So we're talking like that's a good chunk of money. That like now my math might be really off, but I mean that's nothing to sneeze at in terms of like the overall like how they're translating that kind of money. And a sterling, especially when you're talking about like a full sterling pound to be exchanged for a good or a service at that time, you know, people who had full sterling pounds just flipping around for goods or services, like you had money, you were wealthy. Most people traded in pence or shillings for the most part. So think about it. Think about the fact that this Bostonian is saying, my eldest daughter, who is at 14, is constantly spinning and making me better, what I consider to be better quality, that is stuff that is coming from England that I now have to pay tax on.
Well, keep in mind again that this, remember what I talked about earlier about the gentry. The gentry considered like homespun stuff to be quote unquote rough and of lower quality than the stuff that you could get from the stores, like from England, because it was considered that the gentry in England that wove these things were more skilled. And so the fact that he's bragging this is a gigantic spit in the eye to the ideas of the gentry of the time. They're like, to give you guys an idea, a British writer observed that the ladies like spun for 6 days. There it was the Daughters of Liberty, the Boston Gazette. So again, you know, you're looking at Massachusetts is where it started. The ladies of Ipswich went to their vicar's home in Boston, where though some were only 13 years old and the temperature soared, they spun steadily from early morning until 6 that night and scored the accolade from the local paper. Their behavior was decent, and they manifested nothing but pleasure and satisfaction in their countenances as they're retiring, as though through the whole preceding transactions of the day. He said that these women would show up for 6 days of the week. On the 7th, the parson, quote, set to work to preach up the manufacturers instead of gospel, and reaped a better profit than the other spinners, for they generally clothed the parson and his family with the produce of their labor. This was a new species of enthusiasm that might and justly be termed the enthusiasm of the spinning wheel. And this actually spread all over the country as women realized this is one of the ways they could get their voice heard. So they did this massive thing where they could make more money for their families, or at the very least clothe their families for cheap, which, remember, this was a time when clothing was so expensive, you know, $40 to $50 a pair for a pair of socks. This was not a time where, like, you know, you had automatic weaving machines that ran on electricity. This was a time where everything had to be made by hand. So this higher quality stuff, being forced to buy it, you might have 3 pairs of socks for, you know, for your entire week. You might have 2 or 3 shirts. You might have to wash the same shirts every day while you're, you know, if you're AFAB, while your husband retired naked and you clean their stuff in the house. Like, this is how poor people were. This was a massive liberation that they went through as spinners and weavers, and they did it with women's arts. It was this huge political statement that was still made within the domesticity of the home, and it was itself a big rebellion, but it also played an incredibly key role in winning the Revolutionary War. And that's where we're about to get into, because this is really freaking cool. This gets very briefly mentioned sometimes when it, you know, when they talk about like, oh, well, women would show up and cheer the troops. Oh, no. Women played an incredibly key role in supplying the troops with the very fabric, yarn, you know, like there were tales of troops having to march until their feet bled because their stockings and their shoes would wear out, and women would brave journeys, you know, months out from home to deliver home donated stockings and shirts and things that they had darned and mended or made brand new for the troops. The majority of the supply for the troops came from this home industry, because if you're at war with the British, where the hell are you getting your shit from? If it were not for this sort of Boston Tea Party of womanhood, the Revolutionary War would not have succeeded.
Yeah, and here's another factor. The part of, and like I said, I brought up the South, specifically the Carolinas, for a reason. General Nathaniel Greene, who, like, in the U.S. very specifically, we almost idolize. We realistically, we almost deify George Washington, like the general who won the war. Honestly, Nathaniel Greene, General Nathaniel Greene, also known as the Swamp Fox, had a massive impact. And a lot of it was also the women of the South. Because cotton, you spin cotton, you can make clothing out of it. It's a very durable material. It is capable of being worn in the swamps of the Carolinas and in the South. It is something that you can coat with oil. Women, especially if they're in port towns, from sailors knew how to create oilcloth, which you make powder kits out of. Some women were literally part of the logistics lines, packing powder kits, food rations, helping supply trains get literally ready to go.
But also there was one woman who, I'm going to have to go digging for her name, but one of the things that she would do is, and this directly relates to knitting, by the way, she helped run a tavern in which British generals would retire and gossip and plan and that sort of thing. It was considered to be a safe place, but she herself, of course, was a daughter of liberty. And so one of the things she'd do is she would record messages that she would overhear, intel messages about plans and things from them. She would slip them into her ball of yarn, go out to this one particular ridge near where the army would walk by, and would, like, whoops, accidentally drop the ball of yarn. They would take the message out with the key intel and hand it back to her. And she delivered incredibly important information that way, just looking like, oh, all I'm doing is knitting a stocking.
Yep. What are they going to do? Search the yarn?
Yeah, like, why would they do that? And so, like, part of the reason why the Revolutionary War, why the British were kind of resting on their laurels and didn't quite expect it as much as they did, was because they didn't realize how much this home industry was flourishing. Like, this was done kind of in the style of, like, speakeasies and stuff. This was done in churches. This was done in basements. This was done secretly. And so they didn't realize how much, because the textile industry in America was just kind of limping along. They didn't realize that the home industry was overtaking everything. So they expected the supply lines to, when they got cut, to do a lot more damage, but they didn't. So, like, after the war started, the Congress appointed a clothier general to estimate the army's needs and supply, like, state assemblies and stuff, but they didn't have enough funds to actually enforce forcing these communities to give up their yarns and things. And so bands of women, the Daughters of Liberty, would go about collecting extra blankets and, like, stockings and clothes. All these things that were generated by this Boston Tea Party activity would then sometimes be unraveled to make supplies for the troops, or to just be provided directly to the troops if they were in excess.
Right there. Kelpie found it. Molly Old Mom Rinker.
Yes, Molly Rinker.
Yeah. Ali Lee, yes. Claire Hunter's book, Threads of Life, A History of the World Through the Eye of a Needle, is actually a fantastic freaking book. I only read it once when I was in a library. Nice pun, Marrow Cat. And I actually found it to be great. One of the things is that knitting is one of the any needlecraft, to be more
Weaving
specific.
primarily through most of history. Knitting is a relatively recent invention,
This
maybe
is true.
400 to 500 years old as far as we know. But like weaving is older than time, man. Like as long as humans have been
Right.
clothing themselves, we have been weaving something. Like basket weaving even predates weaving textiles.
Right. This is why I changed it to needlecraft, because they lumped weaving into that, which is really dumb. But language. Anyway, needlecraft of any type, basically the formation of textiles to clothe a body, has had such an impact on history. Um,
Well, think
whether
about like in
it's
ancient Greece, like the peplos was this
Mhm.
giant, like gigantic, beautiful, intricate like textile that would be woven to be like given specifically to Athena. Like peploi were clothing that everybody wore, but there was this giant one that was woven with specific mythological scenes into it as this almost tapestry that was also clothing for Athena's statue. Like it was
right.
given as an offering every year. If you haven't seen it, my video on the Athenian New Year actually covers that topic pretty thoroughly. But the idea of clothing has always been difficult to procure. It is only within the past 75 years or so that fast fashion has been a thing and that it has been made outside of the home and outside of the village. Like primarily, dyes have always been expensive. Weaving takes a ton of time, and the majority of unpaid labor that women have performed through history have been things like weaving and cooking. And usually children at a very young age were taught as well, just like knitting in the US.
That's right. And part of that is because one of the main things that ends up happening is one of the big things that once you have the material, once you have the garment, the larger thing that that you focus on ends up being upkeep.
Yeah, darning is a big skill.
Darning almost is more of a skill than just making the garment to begin with, because like once you get like it really depends on it it, it really depends on perspective.
It depends on
I
the
personally
complexity of the work.
Right. I personally say knowing the skill at all, like go for it. Like it's freaking
Maybe
awesome.
maybe nowadays. What Again, our fast fashion sort of it's cheaper to replace your clothing than it is to fix it. That is a very modern attitude. It is extremely modern.
Yes.
Especially if you start to get into making your own homemade clothing, you'll learn very quickly why our ancestors, so to speak, all of them, no matter where you're from, no matter what culture you are from, our ancestors, TM, of the female persuasion, people that were identified as women by their cultures, were forced to spend the majority of their time doing it. It can take hours and days, even if you're the fastest knitter, just to make a pair of socks.
Yep. And even if you are identified as male and you took up that particular trade, same thing applies. You could have the most dexterous hands, either on the other side of it. You could be really skilled. It's a time thing. It is time consuming. And, that's actually one of the reasons why the British thought we've basically shut down the American economy. I don't. I'm literally saying, like, I'm literally learning how to knit or crochet myself. Like, this is a skill. I am in awe of people who do it. I have been told by people that darning
Yeah, Allie
is
Lee.
more of a skill.
Yeah, Allie Lee. Setting sleeves in an arms. I completely agree with you there.
Yeah.
That's part of why I did because it depends on what it is you're trying to make. Because especially clothing, especially like shirts and things, yeah, screw sleeves all the time. But like they're sarcastic tendencies, that's absolutely true. They probably use the fabric in old clothes to make new things too, if the fabric was still good. And that's what we're about to get into. So, flash forward a couple of years. We're now in the throes of the Revolutionary War. We're stuck in the trenches, so to speak. We are using battle tactics. We are getting into massive fights, and the soldiers are running out of shit because now we don't have the British to trade with anymore because obviously they're mad at us. The French haven't quite joined the fray yet. And we're dealing with massive clothing shortages to the point where, again, we have journal entries of the generals talking about soldiers marching until their feet bled, and actually some of the women we're about to talk about tracking the soldiers through the bloody footprints. This is how dire straits we're talking. Women start collecting. They called themselves the Maids of Orleans and the Daughters of Liberty, as we mentioned before. But there was also Lady Washington's Ladies Club. And these were organizations and bands and collectives that would go out and they would go to people's houses and ask them for any excess clothing, blankets, other things that they could donate to the troops. They would unravel them, they would make them into what the troops needed or repair them. But then we also have women like Mary Fraser of Chester County in Pennsylvania who would saddle up their horse, round up blankets, yarn, and half-worn clothing that she would patch, darn, make wearable and comfortable, etc., set up through the night, and then go in the dead of winter when this journey is dangerous as hell. Like, keep in mind, riding a horse in winter, your horse can slip and die just as easily as a car can go flying off a ridge. Like, these are things that can happen, and you'll be stranded and you'll die. She would go over and over, year by year, month by month, day by day, more than 300 pairs of stockings she would prepare and take to the camp with dry clothing, food. She would trace the way like foraging parties from the camps would go by the marks of bleeding feet on the snow.
Yeah. On top of that, one of the bigger things is, like, we all talk about Valley Forge and the struggle that Washington had trying to requisition supplies from the what do they call it? The Congress at the time. Continental Congress.
Yeah, I was about to say, weren't they still a Confederacy at that point?
It was
because like America was a confederacy, and then it became states and like sort of a marble cake federalist, and then
right from 1776 until 1786, it was the Confederacy of the United Confederacy of America, which
was modeled after the Iroquois Confederacy, and we'll get into that someday.
And here's so during one of the major trips, especially during specifically the winter of 1774-75, when Valley Forge hit, that was a particularly brutal winter up and down the Northeast. Like, it was so cold that, like, even while the British had better lodging, had better supplies and things, like, it hit them really hard. It hit civilian populations incredibly hard, especially if they were poorer. But at the same time, Washington's Ladies Club still went out, did the same thing. A lot of the reason that the Clothier General of the Continental Congress was able to gather the supplies come midwinter when the storms lessened was because of these ladies clubs. And then when...
Hey, Marrow.
Hey, cool. Hey, Marrow.
You're taking a hot sec to explain what it is. What are you, like, where are you trying to get at?
One of the other things that I found out when researching Valley Forge in high school was stashes of yarn were also placed in the supply caravans.
Mm-hmm. Because these caravans would come through and they would stay with the camps for brief periods of time. They actually knitted bandages for the soldiers too with that yarn.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's the other thing. Is like women couldn't get close to Valley Forge. It was considered too close to the front line. So it was too dangerous to have what would normally be called an army camp or camp followers nearby. Um, so women normally would follow up uh, and help the army out, repairing stuff, uniforms and things like that. So most of the men at this point of the war were younger.
Kelpie, I've seen this, but it's heavily disputed. I've seen anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years as the conservative estimate that I've seen in a lot of like different books on the subject. There are some researchers that believe it originated in Egypt and the Middle East, but it's disputed whether or not the artifacts they found were actually knitting needles or whether they were closer to like a crochet type hook.
I always thought they would look more like a shuttlecock for like a early, or a smaller loom.
But the point is they're not sure if that was knitting or if it was just a different form of weaving.
Right. But anyway, so what they found in some of the supply caches sent to the Valley Forge were balls of yarn, so that the soldiers could. It was like a morale thing as well. Like when you send letters to the front, soldiers were able to give themselves something to do in the middle of winter. Patching your own equipment in the middle of basically winter gives you something to do. Takes your mind off of your situation, and it reminds you of home in a way, because that's what you did when you were younger. You patched your clothes, you sewed, you reminded. It gives the soldiers something to remind themselves of what they did as youths. Yeah, balls of yarn, because you got to keep in mind, at the time, the bulk of what was considered the uniform was wool. It was considered the most sturdy garment, like for the outer jackets.
Wool, linen, and cotton.
Right. So your gaiters, your pants, and your undershirt were generally linen. Then you had
stockings were damn near always wool. There's nothing
Yeah.
as durable and as well wearing as wool for
Oh, yeah.
stockings. Even in the modern day, if your socks are made of anything else, then I'm sorry.
Yeah, they're just not going to last. Yeah, if you take a look at any replica or surviving piece of a revolutionary soldier's regalia, the full wear from stockings, gaiters, breeches, shirt, underjacket, vest, and then the overcoat. You're talking linen, muslin, depending on where you are, and then wool, and then because that outer coat is almost always wool, and that's usually what got damaged the most.
Well, and Kelpie summarized what you're saying kind of well there. The army men would not have functioned without the women. Women followed the troops and would do the mending and the cooking just like at home. And that is very much true. A lot of people forget that the women actually did do a good chunk of the cooking. They brought supplies, they brought food, because the British troops were far less likely to kill women and children. Like they had their own danger, mind you, but there was a certain measure of that, like of that safety, where they could get away with going back and forth. But one of the other big things again was Lady Washington. So let's talk about Lady Washington, because her husband thought that she was such a badass that he requested payment for her trips, documented every charge, and the American government ended up owing her $27,665.30 by the end of the war.
Which at that time, that's a lot of money.
That is an incredible amount of money. She would bring large groups of like women, particularly highborn ladies, in to do knitting and sewing, and she would direct them. She did a lot of the cooking for the troops. And she also directed things to be unwound and turned into bandages.
Yeah.
And this is one of the big things is hand knitted bandages. Again, they could not buy these things.
And Mary Washington, for everything, so a lot of people kind of discount Mary Washington for a number of things, and they kind of just
Usually if she gets mentioned as an aside, it's usually, oh, well, she would show up at the camps and like with the women and they would cheer the troops. And it's like,
right.
yeah, they did that, but it's so much.
One of the other things is she was considered an autodidact in that she learned a lot of medical stuff. The reason that she's focused so heavily on the bandages, very specifically, she watched British officers and learned about binding wounds. Very specifically, keep in mind, Washington, before the Revolutionary War, was a colonel, which is a very high position for a basically an auxiliary soldier in the British Army. So he got wounded before. Who patched him up? Mary Washington.
Well, she also had some amount of battle acumen as well. Like she understood a lot more than like she would give her husband advice on like it, and this is in her biography, mind you. She would give her husband advice on like troop movement and stuff like that.
Yeah, and told him that he was an idiot for certain things too. So
so I went. You guys asked me to convert it. I found a CPI inflation calculator from 1776 to today. $37,000, so not the total amount, would have been $1,126,488. That's how much work she did. That's how much she ended up getting paid. She knitted apparently over 700 stockings just by herself, not counting all of the women that she took with her. Here are some choice quotes about Lady Washington. This one was Mrs. Westlake, a 16-year-old Valley Forge stout girl who sometimes went with her, gave this to to Mrs. Washington's biographer. I never in my life knew a woman so busy from early morning to late at night as was Lady Washington, providing comforts for the sick soldiers. Every day, excepting Sundays, the wives of officers in the camp and sometimes other women were invited to Mrs. Potts Washington's Valley Forge headquarters to assist her in knitting socks, patching garments, making shirts for the poor soldiers when materials could be produced. Every fair day, she might be seen with a basket in hand and a single attendant going among the huts, seeking the keenest and most needy sufferers and giving to them all the comforts in her power. So she went back to Mount Vernon, which is where he lived, in the spring and summer, but always came back in the fall. She's credited with improving the morale of the soldiers, like while she was sitting kind of knitting stockings, but she also played a massive role in the fact that they were even able to maintain their clothing.
Yep. It really is one of those things. It's like you can't never discount the value of what women did. The fact that women's knitting clubs, women's sewing clubs, weaving, all of these things up and down the 13 colonies, literally impacted the logistical just support network, morale, the ability of the fighting capacity of the revolutionaries to just keep going.
Well, and this is where we start to get some of the seeds of the later women's liberation movements, because we start to see the seeds of them. Eliza Wilkinson of Charleston, who had won her spurs by bravely defying the British and alone maintaining her parents' plantation during the war, seeds with the injustice of the bias against women. I won't have it thought that because we are the weaker sex as to bodily strength, my dear, we are capable of nothing more than minding the dairy, visiting poultry houses, and all such domestic concerns. Our thoughts can soar aloft. We can form conceptions of things of a higher nature. We have just a sense of honor, glory, and the great actions as these lords of creation. I would not wish that we should meddle in the affairs of what is unbecoming to female delicacy, but surely we have sense enough to give our opinions without being reminded of our spinning and household affairs as the only matters of which we are capable of thinking, speaking of with justness or propriety. I won't allow it. I simply won't. And the thing is, this sort of started to fester, but then women kind of shifted back into the domestic sphere for a while after the war was won. It wasn't until sort of after and during the Civil War that you start to really see women's activism. And a lot of that came about because of women opposing slavery. That's when women got heavily, heavily involved in politics all over again.
In a weird way, you know what really helped with that? Harriet Tubman. And and it sucks because, and this is going to sound really rude because I'm saying this, it sucks because Harriet Tubman has been tokenized so often because she was a woman and black and a former slave. And that in lies the problem. At the same time, Harriet Tubman also pointed out that women have the ability to literally change lives. Women can do more. And it's the same thing. It's like pointing straight back to knitting clubs. The same thing happened during the Civil War, even with the massive amount of industrialization that happened. So
yeah, like, so when you look back, you know, this is the majority of this particular topic. Like, we could get into individual women and accounts and I could read more quotes, but the too long didn't read is that women played an incredibly key role in several areas of industry, both maintaining their husbands, you know, accounts, and even after they died, maintaining their property, but also showing up. And without women, the Revolutionary War would not have been won.
oh yeah, there are literally accounts where.
Oh, thank you so much, Coyote. Coyote says, I'm fairly positive I've learned more in the past hour than during my entire 12 years of cool history classes. Yeah, and for those of you who want to know what book I'm pulling these quotes from, by the way, the name of the book that I'm reading is No Idle Hands, The Social History of American Knitting. I have graduated from thinking about knitting all the time to knitting all the time to even when I go and I take my hot tub baths to get my back to relax, I will bring a book in there with me. And I've started reading knitting memoirs and histories of needlecraft. And this is one of the ones I picked up, and I have been engrossed in it. I ended up gushing at Jen about this, and Jen was one of the folks who like really wanted me to do a stream on this topic because this is just the first 2 chapters of this book. Like, this is just me covering some of the info in the first 2 chapters. If you guys want more streams like this in the future where I talk more about like the history of knitting and needlecraft and the way that women have sort of changed the world with their industry, I would be happy to do more of that. Let me know after the video is over in the description below if that is something that you want. If you add it in the live chat, I will see it. But if you put it in the description, it will count because I will actually be able to keep track of how many of you put something in, or not in the description, in the comments. In the comments after the video. If you put it in the comments, I can keep track more easily of how many of you said something. So please, you know, if you want to say it in the live chat, go ahead, but please wait until after the video is over, go down into the comments and let me know if you want more videos on the history of needlecraft and women's role in world history. I know that's a little outside of what I normally do, and most of this is like lefty pagan stuff, but I feel like, you know, kind of reframing history a little bit through the eyes of minority folks, whether that's minority, you know, genders in terms of who's talked about, or a minority, you know, religious stuff, or minority, you know, peoples. Reframing history and talking about things that do not get talked about is something that I'm very, very passionate about. That's part of the reason I started my channel.
Right. Well, okay, so like for those who don't know me that well, I mean, Aaliyah Kai has actually physically met me. Um,
Yeah, when
so
after the doctor's appointment, we ended up spending almost an hour talking about like I what was it? It was neopronouns.
neopronouns. So a very brief description. Uh, if I ever decide to pop my camera on, I am white as hell. All right, primarily
And when we're
because
sitting next to each other, you can see that I am not.
right. But here's the reason I bring this up. I'm absolutely fascinated by Irish history, and a lot of people will take a look at Irish history and be going like, "Why are you fascinated by that? That just seems really depressing and wrong." And you know why? Grace O'Malley, mid 1560s, literally called the Pirate Queen of Ireland, was the biggest thorn in the side of the British, the English crown at the time. Other figures, mainly women. There was multiple women throughout history that I have looked up, primarily because of one of my English teachers who I am still in contact with, that have reshaped the way that I look at history. One of the reasons that I was so willing to jump into this conversation, into this stream, was because of finding out about this. And I went to my English teacher, not my history teacher. I went to an English teacher and said, "Hey, did you know about this?" She's like, "Oh, yeah. Women of history, that's my thing." So, yeah. Uh,
But if
you
you
know,
guys are interested in having me do more streams on these sorts of topics, like again, needlecraft is something that has a direct tie to my channel because Athena is my patron goddess. And when you talk about votive offerings, 90% of mine are going to be knitted, sewn, or woven. Like that's just the end of it. Like the majority of what I do with my hands when I'm not like on my computer working is knitting. Like that, I do it for hours every day. And so, like these sorts of history things, if you guys enjoyed this, if you want me to do more of it, again, please let me know in the comments. We're getting pretty close to an hour. I'm not sure if we have all that much more to cover on this particular topic. Do you have any sort of final thoughts that you want to express to the chat?
um, oh, Jericho, why English teacher? Because my English teacher was, think RGB, younger, and just like willing to slap somebody upside the head when they deserved it. So that's why. Um, history, especially when it comes to topics like this, this is why I get into. This is why I love being in the Discord. Um, it's fascinating to understand different points of view, because like just being in here, there were parts that I didn't have a clear understanding of, because I didn't have that book, for example, even just the first two chapters.
Well, and this book is one of the first ever written on this particular topic. It's an older book, but like the author in the intro actually has a really interesting. If you don't mind me sharing this passage a little bit.
Oh, please do. Actually, I would love to hear it.
So this is from the first page of the introduction. So like the little like Roman numerals part of the book where the author sort of rambles about themselves. But I think that it's kind of indicative of why we don't hear about this, right? Because this is a woman historian. Her name is Anne MacDonald.
Mm-hmm.
And when you read this first paragraph, it's a little bit of a long passage, but I'll read it to you. It gives you kind of an idea of why we don't hear about this. A social history like this was considered beyond the pale of a real history, quote unquote, when I was growing up. And I well remember my father's indignation when his only son, a Yale history major, enrolled in a distinguished professor's course in American social history that was irreverently nicknamed Pots and Pans by the prankish students. In those Depression days, my father equated expenditure on such twaddle with money down the drain, and the message was not lost on his youngest. When I hit college in big time a few years later, I prudently matriculated educated in political science and history, and consorted with kings, presidents, prime ministers, and emperors with a dash of wars and treaties on the side. The virtual dearth of women's affairs and historical texts struck me as deplorable, but in the 30s and 40s, I was not spurred to demand the exhumation of her story, nor of her story. Nor could I have conceived that one day I would write a book primarily on women, especially about their knitting. This book grew not from a decision to write women into history, for knitting was certainly not the vehicle for elevation of their status, but from curiosity piqued by my own history of unflagging knitting. With no genetic endowment from my non-knitting mother, an architectural engineer and homemaker, an indifferent knitter maternal grandmother, proud college graduate whose unsolicited pro-New Deal political comments kept the pot boiling in our Republican household, and a tatting but unapproachable paternal grandmother, my two sisters and I, impelled by some ancient urge, took up the needle and blossomed into dedicated knitters and sewers. To my knowledge, our brother, the aforementioned pots and pans fellow, metamorphosed into a bank president, horseman, and knowledgeable collectors of antiques, lifted a needle neither in anger nor in delight, but luckily married a gifted and delightful stitcher. Of the many questions I heard about knitting, I kept returning to why don't men knit?
And
so basically, this book grew out of a question that this author had about, hey, there's the thing I love to do, but it's almost kind of like a secret shame, right? Like, right. Even the way that she describes it, she's like, I don't know why I got into it, but yet my hands are perpetually kept busy. And, like, her question was, why don't men do it? Why is it considered unmanly? And that's why she wrote an entire over 400-page book on the topic of the social history of knitting. And the thing is I picked this book up and I found that just reading bits and pieces of like the colonial women's diaries and things that she quotes in this book have made me feel less alone as a knitter myself. Like there have been moments where like she talks about like these sort of transliterations of these like older diaries and things where they talk about how their hands were never idle, how there was always something to do, some way to make yourself productive at all times, even when you're sitting there like listening to something.
Right.
And I related to that.
And that's just that alone. That's the kind of book that draws me in. Like that introduction, that book would come off the shelf with me had I like found it on a bookshelf and be like, all right, this is history. Read the introduction. Coming home. All right, I got it.
So for those of you who want to pick it up, it is out of print as far as I know. I got my copy used. It is called No Idle Hands, The Social History of American Knitting. It is by Anne L. MacDonald, and that's MacDonald, MacDonald. It is an incredible book. I'm enjoying it. It's very engagingly written. It's definitely more of a history book than a memoir or anything, but it just, again, we covered the first 2 chapters, basically.
Yeah.
There is so much here. And I would love, if you guys want me to do a series on this book and on the information in it, I would love to do that. This is a very, like, sort of narrower lens than the other book, the Eye of the Needle book that was recommended earlier. This specifically focuses on American knitting from the colonial period onward. And so, like, it's specifically about that. And it's fascinating. It is absolutely fascinating.
And okay, so, like, and this is where it gets really interesting because, while I have no idea how this book is going to get into knitting and stuff like Civil War, expansion into the West, getting into the early 1900s, up to the point when this author wrote it.
We go back to knitting in the circle of domesticity, westward knit, knitting for the blue, knitting for the gray. So we covered the Civil War on both sides. Mid-century knitters, sporty Victorian knitters, old knitters in new roles. Oh, say can you knit for Sammy? Men and children for Sammy too. Flappers versus the old-fashioned knitters. The 30s knitting craze. The 40s knitting in War and Peace. Knitting from A to Z. Argyles to Zimmerman. And knitting now and Wither Knit. So it goes all the way up to what was considered the present at the time that the book was published.
And that would be Zimmerman. So that's 1960s.
Yep. Zimmerman, by the way, is a brilliant author. And if you are a knitter and you can get your hands on her books, oh my God, is she a joy to read. And her patterns can be frustrating, but her collections are incredible.
Oh, Kaleidoscope says it's on Kindle.
Oh, it's on Kindle. That's incredible. That's amazing. I had to get myself an older copy because I couldn't find a physical copy.
I don't know if you can get it on ebook. Cool.
That's awesome. Yeah.
On
I
Kindle
highly recommend
you. Nice.
Yeah, I highly recommend you guys check it out. And again, if you want me to do a series, let me know in the comments. I can do a series on this book and on the history in it, and just on like sort of minority history in general. I know this isn't primarily a history channel per se, in the sense that like my focus on history is in service of a particular thing, namely reconstructed religion. But if you guys are interested in stuff like this is another major passion of mine. And also, in the future, I'm looking at potentially getting a sponsorship. I don't have it right now, but I am in talks for a particular knitting box that I get that I love, that I might actually be able to do an affiliate type thing with. So if you guys are interested in that, that is something that I can do. And the affiliate that I'm looking at will get me a free box and you guys 50% off. That's kind of what we're looking at right now. And like, again, I'm not getting paid actual cash. I'm just getting my knitting habit fed. So that would be wonderful.
I mean, yeah. Originally, that's how it was. My focus was originally going to set up, because I do technically have a channel here on YouTube. I don't have anything on it. Let's be honest. I have shelved a lot of my YouTube anything for the time being, because I have school, I have other things outside of this. But my focus was actually going to be history. Broadly, mostly Celtic stuff, but the focus was history. So, I mean, this kind of stuff friggin' fascinates me. So, let's be honest. Like, you bring up history, even in the Discord, like some random blue person pointed out, anytime history is mentioned on the Discord, you're probably going to find me there. I spent 45 minutes describing exactly how to put on actual field plate to somebody. So, hey, you want to talk knitting and needlecraft? I'll be there. I want to learn. So let's do it.
Alrighty, so since we're at the hour and 15 mark, I want people to be able to watch through this because we do ramble a little bit a few times.
Oh yeah.
Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us. I know it was kind of a shorter stream, but the topic, like I said, it's about 2 chapters of a book that we were covering, but it's really fucking cool, and I needed to ramble at somebody about it, so why not ramble at my whole audience, right? Like, y'all voted for it. So thank you guys again for turning out. And
if you want to, tell you what, if you want to bring me back, because one, I know that we found the digital copy of this, I'm going to read this. If you want to bring me back after I've read this, I'll be happy to ramble to you about this book. We can turn this into a temporary series for you.
Yeah, let's turn that. You know what? If y'all want to get the book, let's turn this into a book club series. Let's do this periodically whenever Jen is having problems, or maybe even the mythical Saturday streams that I keep saying may or may not happen. Let's talk about potentially doing this as a series for a little while, because obviously with recent events, my Wine Rant series has been put on hold for a little while. We can do this as a book club if y'all want to go read the book with me. So let's learn together, and because as we've said many, many times, we're stronger together. Thank you guys so much.
Cheers, guys.